Hi. I have talked a lot on my channel about how to approach English learning, but I've rarely talked about the things that I have been doing myself at this point to keep up with my English practice. English learning is a very dynamic process, and we know that without regular practice, the progress we have made to this point could be lost. So in this video, I want to talk about 3 things that I have been doing for the past few years to improve my English. And yes, I still do need to improve my English. I get nervous sometimes when I talk about things that I'm unfamiliar with. I make mistakes from time to time. Once in a while, I notice an error in my pronunciation as well. But I guess compared with before, like years ago, I now focus less on particular aspects of my English skills, but more so try to assess my own English skills holistically. And for that reason, most of the practices that I do are no longer done in isolation. So if you are in a similar situation as mine as well, that's what I would recommend for you. When you get to a point where you can speak your mind fairly comfortably, where you have little trouble finding the accurate words to express your ideas and emotions, now would be the time for you to look at the big picture, assessing your language skills as a whole. Instead of zoning in on one aspect, try to identify the general weaknesses in your language usage. Maybe it's a particular writing style that you're not very confident about, or you're having some trouble having small talks with others, or you're simply trying to improve your speech flow, maybe because it doesn't sound very natural. All right, so the first thing I have been doing is watching TV shows. Now, I watch a lot of different English TV shows, but in this case, I'm referring to the times when I'm watching TV shows specifically for the purpose of English learning. I don't generally do this with new shows because I know I'm not going to pay much attention to the language used in the new show as I do with the plot. So I always have a few shows on rotation. Right now, I'm kind of switching back and forth between Friends and The Office. The way I usually do it is that I would leave it in the background while I'm buzzing around the house, for example, when I'm doing dishes or when I'm doing other chores. But I do want to point out again that the reason why I chose these particular shows is that I have watched them so many times that I remember most of the lines in the show. I am already very familiar with the characters and the plots in these shows that I don't really have to pay attention to them. My focus is no longer on what's happening in the show or in that particular episode, but what kind of language is being used in different scenes. I simply enjoy immersing myself in an English language environment like this. It's very cozy, and I tend to remember more in such a relaxing environment. So this practice helps me check my pronunciation, revisit some of the expressions that I've learned all these years from these shows, and also allows me to practice my listening big time. I usually either leave the subtitles off or I just don't pay attention to them. I guess technically in these cases, I tend to listen to these shows, tend to listen to how the lines are being said by the actors and actresses in these shows. Another thing that I have been doing for years is reading English books. And I have been going back and forth between fictions and non-fictions. And lately, I've been really on a non-fiction stream. And when I say lately, I really meant the past 3 years. I guess I now feel like getting into some fiction is more energy consuming. It's like watching a movie or TV show. Once you start, you can't stop until you've seen the end. So in a way, it's quite a time commitment to get it done in one or a couple of sittings. Whereas with nonfictions, I can simply read a couple of chapters here and there without feeling the need to get to the end right away. Reading is the one thing that has helped me significantly and continues to help me all these years. And I've touched upon this topic before. Reading is probably the best way we could improve our English language skills, more specifically to help us develop that English way of thinking. You know, we all talk about it in order to speak the language more naturally and to learn it more effectively. Knowing the English way of thinking definitely makes a big difference. And I find this is especially true with reading nonfictions. You see how a general idea is broken down into smaller bits and then fleshed out with specific examples to make it much more easily understandable. You can really get to read and experience how ideas are expressed in this foreign language. I think it also creates an immersive experience, but different from TV shows, reading forces us to be more invested in the understanding of the material. It also allows us to become a lot more comfortable with understanding the meanings of these English texts without feeling the need to translate everything into Chinese. I really cannot recommend this practice more. I think anyone who is even remotely interested in trying to speak this language fluently and naturally should give it a try. Of course, not every one of us starts with a book from day one. Actually, probably none of us does. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can start with something small. We can start with an article, an essay, or even a paragraph. You can definitely do that if you find English books a bit intimidating or you feel like your language skills aren't there yet. But the reason why I always recommend reading books to my students is that even if you want to just read one paragraph every day, it's much easier for you to keep going if all the content eventually comes together. Whereas with individual articles, sometimes we might just not be as motivated to read articles about 100 different topics. Another question I often get asked is, how many books should I read in a year or in a month? I think this question is really personal because there are many factors at play here. Obviously, the more you read, the faster you will become comfortable with reading English books, and the sooner you will start enjoying it. But it depends on your current language level, how fast you can read, and how much time you have. And it also depends on what kind of books you're interested in. We all know that we should start with something that's within our interests. The third and the last thing that I have been doing for the past years is writing. I used to write journals, writing about my day, important event, or difficult times, you know the drill. But I have to admit that I'm really bad at keeping it consistent. I don't know if any one of you had similar experience, but in my house, I have so many notebooks that I've only used probably 5 to 10 pages of, because every time when I feel like, okay, now it's time for me to start journaling again, I would always use a new notebook. And now I feel very embarrassed every time when I see them laying around. It's such a wasteful way to do that. I also do reflections as well. Maybe I would write weekly reflections, probably about my work, what I have done well at work, what still needs to be improved, and things like that. Even though I wrote here and there, I kept on writing. And since I started my channel last August, I have been writing very consistently, mostly preparing content for my videos. Now, I don't write a script every single time. Really depends on the topic and depends on how inspired I feel every time sitting in front of a camera. But I have to say, every time I would come up with, at the very least, main outline. So I would write down the ideas I want to include in this particular video and how I'm going to build my argument or how I'm going to lay out my explanation. And I have to say, the past few months of writing really made a change. I used to dread writing a lot because it was just so painful. I would sit down in front of a computer for 2 hours and I wouldn't be able to come up with a thing. But now writing has actually become a way for me to sort through my thoughts. It really helps clear my head and really helps me organize my thoughts in a very logical way. And I find that it keeps me focused on the topic. Because sometimes when I start to talk about things, I start to ramble, and then very easily I go off the topic, and before we know it, 5 minutes have passed. I don't want that to happen. So writing definitely does make a big difference for me. So unless you have only been learning English for a few months, I would recommend starting your writing today. It could be just a few sentences every day or a few paragraphs, depending on where you are with your language skills. But writing something allows you to be very honest with yourself and recognize what you can express and what you cannot. It forces you to use what you know in the English language, the expressions, structures, grammar, and also face how much you don't know. I find sometimes it gives me some direction as to what topics I should be learning about in the next few weeks. So these are the things that I have been doing consistently in the past decade to keep my English skills polished. And as you can see, a good learning strategy is not complicated at all. Putting consistent efforts towards your regular practice is what's going to make the big difference.